anglojęzycznych internautów. Good evening, welcome to our online feed. Short housekeeping remark for the start. We have online live transmission in Polish and English. Surprisingly, if you can hear me now, you are on the Polish channel. You can find the link to the English language channel in the event description on YouTube. A teraz już po polsku. Witam Państwa na pierwszym w tym roku wykładzie w ramach Copernicus Festival organizowanego przez Centrum Kopernika Badań Interdyscyplinarnych, Fundację Tygodnika Powszechnego i Uniwersytet Jagielloński. Dziękujemy też Muzeum Narodowemu, że przyjmuje nas tutaj jak od pierwszej edycji festiwalu. I nie będę przedłużał. Przed Państwem profesor Antonio Damasio, professor Antonio Damasio, a man who needs no introduction. Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening to all. It's a great pleasure to be here with the wonderful Polish hosts and with wonderful colleagues, both here in Poland as well as colleagues from the United States who are here as well. So it's a great pleasure for us to be here. It's our first time in Poland. It's also our first time, obviously, in Krakow, which is a place that we very much wanted to visit, and we have been enjoying it tremendously. So I think I have to control this, and I'm going to look there. It's a very complicated stage. I look there, I look here. I cannot look there for sure. Can people hear? Okay, good. Provided you hear, that's good. So let's start. And the talk today is going to be...
To, co będę w tej chwili mówił,
I would prefer not to hear the wonderful Piotr that is there translating. I'm sure it translates very well, but I don't want to hear you. I want you to hear me. The topic is the strange order of things. I promised to explain to you why we have titled, Hanna and I, why we have titled the lecture that way. But the first issue to deal with is accounting for cultures. And I'm going to ask what appears to be a very simple question, but it's not really, which is why and how did cultures develop? How do we explain the development of practices and instruments that we in general know as the arts, philosophical inquiry, moral and religious systems, governance, including justice, economics, politics, technologies, and sciences? In other words, some of the main examples of the big categories of human cultural development. And the question is really how and why did cultures develop? And in the next slide, you will see what we regard as the conventional answers. The conventional answers are actually quite conventional and quite frequent. There was a time a couple of years ago in which I systematically went from friend to friend, from colleague to colleague, asking exactly that first question. And the conventional answers fall in the following categories. First, the prodigious human intellect. This is by far the most frequent. When you ask people, why is it that all of this developed, but it did not develop, for example, in chimpanzees, who are obviously great mammal examples of biological development? The first and most dramatic answer is that we have a prodigious intellect, and that's why we were able to do it. Part of this, and of course, who would argue with that? Well, obviously, we're not. We entirely agree that that's very important. The second answer has to do with the unique faculty of language. And again, who could argue with that? One of the main reasons for human exceptionalism is the fact that we have verbal language, the kind of thing that I'm using right now for you directly in English, for some other of you in Polish translation, but we have this ability to transform the world of the mind, the narratives that we are making at any time, into a verbal narrative, into word streaming according to a grammar and expressing the meanings that are there non-verbally. So of course, that conventional answer is conventional and important. A third one has to do with particulars of human sociality. Now, we know, of course, that plenty of other animals are very social. In fact, I would dare to say that all creatures that are alive are social, almost by definition. But there's something very special about human sociality. First of all, we're incredibly social, probably more so than any other species before, and there are things that may appear particular about human sociality. So, for example, it has been claimed that we are especially good at having something like joint attention. So not only do we have a society together, but we also have this great ability of looking at an object and having another human look at the same object and create a triadic connection that way. So human sociality, no doubt, is very important for the creation of cultures. And then you have genetic selection of advantageous responses. And that is something that is incredibly important. Obviously, over evolution, over biological evolution, there were certain kinds of responses that could have appeared entirely by chance and that were selected and that were projected into the next generation precisely because they were so advantageous for the species, for the exemplars of the species that carried that sort of feature. Obviously, that's very important. So, what I want to say is that all of these are true and tried. All of these have had a huge role to play in the development of cultures. But I want to add something else, and that something else comes, I hope, in the next slide, and that is a role for affect. And the role for affect, which I want to define, first of all, affect, as a collection of processes that includes drives, motivations, emotions, and feelings. And I want to place affect, and especially I want to place feelings, let me add one more slide, as motivators and monitors and negotiators of the cultural process. So I want to make very clear that the idea here is not that feelings, for example, or affect in general, generated human cultures. First of all, we would have a great problem to deal with, which is the problem that a lot of other species have feelings galore and they did not generate cultures. So obviously that would not be enough. What I'm trying to do is not to neglect feeling, trying to remind us that feelings are systematically neglected. It's the last thing people talk about. And it's very curious because it's like having people around a table talking, and there's one individual, one person that is there. People know that that person is there, but nobody talks to that person. The person is not acknowledged by name. And that person is affect, and that person, quite particularly in this case, is feelings. So the form of the suggestion that I'm making, and here I'm going to read you, and I'm going to put a blank there so that you don't get distracted by any slide. I'm going to read a statement, which obviously I wrote before, but which I think encapsulates this idea. And the simple idea is that feelings of pain and feelings of pleasure, I'm talking about both, from degrees of well-being to malaise and sickness, would have been the catalysts for the processes of questioning, understanding, and problem-solving that most profoundly distinguish human minds from the minds of other living species. And by questioning, understanding, and problem-solving, humans would have been able to develop intriguing solutions for the predicaments of their lives and to construct the means to promote their flourishing. They would have perfected ways of nourishing, clothing, and sheltering themselves. By the way, the earliest of technologies. They would have nursed their physical wounds and begun the invention of what became medicine. When the pain and the suffering were caused by others, by how they felt about others, by how they perceived others to feel about them, or when the pain was caused by considering their own conditions, such as confronting the inevitability of death, humans would have drawn on their expanding individual and collective resources and invented a variety of responses that ranged from moral prescriptions and principles of justice to modes of social organization and governance, artistic manifestations, and religious beliefs. So that fundamentally is the idea that I want to deal with. And since I mentioned medicine, let me give you a more tangible example so that everybody's on the same page. Imagine early humans having a physical condition which could have been a cancer, which could have been trauma and the breaking of a bone, and obviously being, as a result of their fundamental affective equipment, being in suffering, being in pain. And then having some other individuals that had the possibility of helping those first individuals. So you have, first of all, this state of need that is translated fundamentally by affect, by the pain, by the suffering. And then you have a spectator to that state of need who is capable of, for example, having sympathy for what that other person is doing in terms of suffering. It does not even need to be empathy. It does not even need to be compassion. There are many other reasons why that person can exhibit an understanding of what goes on in the other. And most important, there is the intellectual ability to think about a possible solution. And there's something that even there, when you think about the intellectual ability, is quite attached. It's the fact that inventing something, even in an early time of our culture, is not without an advantage for the person that is making the invention. And that tangible advantage is something that could be exhibited or could be, in fact, experienced in the form of a desire to help, but also of a desire to attain a prize, a desire to attain an advantage, something that you could describe in affective terms as an ambition, a yearning. And it could also be actually attached in more modern times to the notion of profit. For example, when you have people that are suffering and need treatment for their suffering, if in fact we're talking about a disease, who would ever think that pharma companies, big pharma, the big drug makers, they're not registering enormous empathy and compassion and desire to help you. What they're registering is an enormous desire to have a profit and make a lot of money with it, which is exactly what they do. Now, that is something that is both connected with an intellectual development and with an invention, but is also connected very deeply with affective aspects, except that they're not the nice, soft, goody-goody aspects only. They also have to do with ambition, with profit. They too are part of our affect, and they play a role. So and before I go any further, I want to say something that is very important here. The fact that I'm emphasizing affect and feelings in particular, which is something that is experienced personally, individually, it's not in the public sphere. You see emotions in others, you don't see the feelings of others. That's extremely important in this conversation. I want to make very clear that I'm not pitting one against the other. It's not that I am preferring feelings over knowledge, reason, the ability to reflect and discern and invent with our intellectual abilities. Not at all. In fact, I would reject any kind of opposition between these two parts of the equation. What defines very much our humanity is this huge capacity that we have inherited from other species of feeling and placing feeling within a very complex intellectual setting, and of course having the possibility of then projecting that intellectual ability into actual creations and into the future. And the other thing that I want to make sure that is clear is that I'm not talking about goody-goody emotions. So it's very interesting when we talk about emotions and feelings, when you talk about affect in general, and when you talk about good things, such as creating cultures, people are, quite understandably, immediately persuaded to think about the good emotions, joy, elevation, feelings of transcendence, or compassion, admiration, all the things that we classify as the good emotions. And I want to make very clear that all of those emotive programs and the consequences they have in terms of feeling can be on the good side or on the bad side. For example, plenty of good things have happened in our cultures and plenty of bad things as a result of anger. Turns out that anger is an emotive program that exists and is very widespread actually because it gives clear advantages to the person who practices anger, because it gives you an immediate advantage over your adversary, and it may actually help you win a game, the game of life. But it doesn't mean that it is good ultimately, but it may have, and in fact very often plays, a role in the development of instruments of culture. So plenty of good things and plenty of bad things in emotional and feeling terms can appear and give advantages or not. They need to be sorted out. And I'm not being an advocate for anger, of course, much on the contrary, but what we need is to make sure that it's all the negatives and the positives. And the positives, the ones that I want to emphasize is this. It's not that the motivator for intellectual developments is necessarily pain and suffering. It can be many others. It can be very often the prospect of pleasure. And here I would like to make a little parenthesis to say that I'm going to talk a little later about the role of memory and the making of memories in the cultural project. And one of the kinds of memory that humans make, and that is very often forgotten, is what Hanna and I like to call memories of the future. What's memories of the future? Sounds a little bit absurd because when you think about memories, you think about the past, the memories you have made of the past. But in fact, we are constantly generating narratives about ourselves to ourselves. And in those narratives, a lot of the things we construct is what the future may be. The things we anticipate, the things we would like to see happen, the things that we would like to avoid that they happen, and all of those are placed in memory as well. So a lot of the time, the things that are driving us are pleasures or sufferings that in fact have never occurred, but could occur, and that are part of our constant planning process, but are committed to memory. That is extremely important to understand. So, one more word and then we launch the rest of the talk, if we have the rest of the talk. I mentioned medicine, I mentioned the invention of a treatment, for example. So, the suffering, let's say, was a motivator. Then I want to have another role for affect, which is the role of monitor. Guess what? If you have pain, and if you take some medication for your pain, obviously the pain is a feeling, and the feeling was the motivator of the entire setting of treatment. How do you know that the medication worked? You know that the medication worked because your pain is reduced. What is that? It's a feeling that you have. It has been transformed. So feelings are not just motivators, they're motivators and monitors of the process. So no matter how much intellectual stuff you have around you in the fabrication of the treatment or in the mode of applying it, there's not just motivation, but also monitoring. And I would say further that the entire life of intellect for us is embedded in affect, and there's a sort of constant negotiation that is going on between the intellectual side and the affective side. That's why I like to say that feelings are motivators, monitors, and negotiators of the cultural process. Okay, now, 2 questions. First, what is the power behind affect? What is the power behind feelings in particular? Because if they do all these things that I'm saying they do, how come they do it? And the second question, how original to humans is the general culture-making strategy that we are proposing? And these are, I think, 2 very important questions. Now, the answer to the first question is that all living creatures share the imperative of regulating their life processes such that life can persist, flourish, and project itself into the future. That's A. B. The functional imperative is known as homeostasis. And not to make too long a story, I want to tell you that the power behind the throne of feelings is in fact homeostasis. So I need to tell you what homeostasis is. We'll deal with that in a second. Next, homeostasis, which is the power behind affect, exists in complex organisms and is partly managed by affective processes. It also exists in non-complex, very simple organisms, and we'll come into that in a minute. But what is very important is that you understand that there is homeostasis in bacteria. There is homeostasis in bacteria that began their life about 3.9 billion years ago, that do not have nuclei in the cells, that do not have nervous systems, that, as far as we can understand, do not have minds, do not have feelings, do not have consciousness, and lo and behold, they do have homeostatic regulation. So homeostatic regulation and life are inseparable, and that is the core principle. But the people in this room are obviously complex organisms. They have complexity that includes not only a multicellularity, the cells of different tissues and organs, but they're a particular kind of system, which is the nervous system, about which more in a second, and that homeostasis is in great part regulated by affective systems. So this is a sort of idea to remember, is that the power behind affect is homeostatic regulation, as far as I can see, and that power in creatures like us is mediated in great part by affective systems. So they are the helpers of this big thing that is being accomplished in a living organism called homeostasis at that level. And the critical component of those affective processes, this is E, is feeling, which is the mental expression of ongoing homeostatic states in living organisms. Now, this is a mouthful, but I'll unpack it very quickly. People very often say, oh, feelings, and they confuse it with emotions, and they think about positive emotions and negative emotions, these sort of little rigid stereotypes. Let's try to think about feeling in physiological terms, in the perspective of general biology, and not just in the perspective of psychology or of neurobiology, and think of feelings exactly as I describe in E. Mental expression of ongoing homeostatic states in the living organism, because that's exactly what they are. Feelings are mental expressions, they are experiences, they require subjectivity. In fact, they are the generators of subjectivity to begin with, and they are private to the individual that has them, and they are reflecting the state of your life at a certain moment. So if you are feeling well, as I hope you are, you will feel something that expresses how your general organism is working at this moment. And if by any chance you were sick, you would feel malaise or some aspect of sickness that would be registered through a feeling that is expressing what the organism is like. So it's not that the feeling is some mental stuff that floats around unmoored and unconnected to the biology. No, the biology is what determines the feeling. That's there as a given, and that's why these things can make sense in the general biological perspective. So, in brief, feelings are mental experiences that accompany body states. They are related to physiological conditions concerned with regulating the organism's interior. This is what I call spontaneous or homeostatic feelings. Again, well-being, flourishing, states of pain, suffering that are related to your basic economy. Those are the spontaneous or homeostatic feelings. But feelings can also be responses to sensory stimuli and to regulatory needs. And that's where this new world of emotion comes in. Action programs that are largely superposed on ongoing physiological regulations and often are prompted by external conditions. And that's what I call provoked or emotional feelings. So if suddenly I see a friend that I have not seen in many years and I'm overjoyed by that fact, what has happened is that the presence of that friend has acted as the prompter, as the cause of a reaction that I have. That reaction is going to be mediated by a number of brain structures that are extremely important and that generate the emotive response. And as a consequence, I'm going to feel in a certain way, which is well, but that feeling well was generated by this complex relationship. Me perceiving a certain person, that person being detected by the less deliberate parts of our nervous system and prompting a reaction, which is in fact a sort of perceptual reaction. It's a sort of relatively stock response to that. And I could also happen to see a person that I detest and feel irritated by the presence of that person. In neither case would I be in full control of that reaction. I would not be fully controlling or manufacturing my joy in one case or my irritation in the other. They would be sort of the first pass that the organism is providing of what is going on in my world. So they are automated devices that help our life. That's what emotions turn out to be. And they ought to be listened to, but not fully, because sometimes they're not good advisors in terms of what to do next. Okay, so we're done with the provoked, and by the way, there was one term there that I want you to remember in case you haven't encountered it, which is action program. Emotions are action programs, whatever the emotion is. So it's a collection of things that the brain will make you do, and that may be at the level of actions that you can take with your gestures or with your facial expression or with things that are happening hormonally or things that are happening with a certain neurotransmitter inside your brain. They are actions. And there's no guarantee that they will become conscious unless you as a system are equipped with the systems that generate subjectivity and therefore can have a feeling. So action programs are about parts of the operation that are active, that by the very term, they are about emotion, about moving out, and not necessarily the inner part of the process, which is the feeling. So, the answer to the second question, I wonder if anybody even remembers what the second question was. The second question was, how original is this business of the fundamental strategies of human cultures? Did we invent them as human beings, or does this have some kind of precedence? So the answer to the question is the human culture-making strategy is not original. It borrows liberally from life regulation in simpler creatures. And here I will just make a sidetrack to say that what I'm talking about is this, and that, by the way, is the reason why this talk is called The Strange Order of Things, which also happens to be the title of a new book of mine, and that strange order refers to the fact that you would expect human cultures, with all of their complexity, to originate fully in strategies that are also human and extremely complex and only available in human beings from very complex brains. And the fact is that they're not. The fact is that the fundamental strategies that we use have been available in living creatures for billions of years, long before there were nervous systems, long before we had the complexity we have. And in fact, there are two big examples that I'm focusing on, and I cannot talk about it in detail because that would be a separate talk or talks. And one has to do with bacteria, and the other has to do with social insects. In both groups, you find incredible examples that are best described as a foreshadowing of cultural effects. For example, bacteria that will congregate or segregate depending on the level of nutrients in the environment. Bacteria that will associate with other bacteria if they detect via molecular probes that those other bacteria are doing what is best for the group, or will reject the other bacteria and literally shun them if they're not doing what is the best for the group. And of course, none of that is being done in a minded, deliberate way. It's being done by simple organisms with a literally bare bones structure, but they're doing something that if you sort of telescope yourself and you're looking at this and my God, that almost looks like a moral behavior, quote unquote. But of course there's no morality in bacteria. Come on. What there is a foreshadowing of what will become eventually something that you could call an ethical behavior if you have the right structure around it and if you have anything that could be the reflection that would lead to ethics, for example. And of course you have the examples of social insects, which are extremely complex. There's a tremendous amount of cultural organization, all the way from constructions of colonies to the services of colonies and so forth. And again, that's a different level because we're talking about invertebrates with a nervous system that's more complex, but again does not have a quality of deliberation and of conscious determination. What there is a very complex organization of behavior that clearly has come courtesy of gene selection. So we have certain frequencies of gene pools that will allow certain organisms to behave in a certain way. That's great, but that doesn't mean that that organism is thoughtful and is mindful of what it's doing. And by the way, there can be also the undergirdings for what will become feeling, but it doesn't mean that they feel. Although we have to reserve the answer in the case of insects, because it could be that there is a very beginning of feeling there. That's not a question that we're going to discuss today. What we need to say is that, as we have there in the slide, homeostasis and the undergirding of affect manage the social behavior of bacteria and of social insects. And we'll connect this with something that I'm going to say in a second. So a little bit more about homeostasis so that you know where I'm going. So homeostasis is not about simple functional equilibrium, because that's, I'm really placing the emphasis of this story on this ability to regulate life. And very often the word homeostasis is problematic because it gives this part of the term, stasis, gives the idea that everything has been brought into equilibrium, and I have to clarify and say that equilibrium is, first of all, very boring, and second, from a thermodynamic point of view, happens to be death. when there is thermodynamic equilibrium, you die. So we don't want thermodynamic equilibrium, and we don't want to be bored if at all possible. So what homeostasis is about the best possible steady state, a state that yields not just the required amount of energy for life to continue, but an energy surplus. So in fact, we're constantly operating, if we are operating well physiologically, in a regime where we generate the energy that is enough to substitute parts of the broken machinery and so forth, but we also have a little bit more that we could describe, quote unquote, as physiological profit, okay? And that physiological profit is what allows us to advance into the next generation. And by the way, my impression is that in fact, the very generation early on in life of genetic systems came by courtesy of that fundamental homeostasis when it was occurring in pre-genetic organisms. So homeostasis and its goals: immediate life regulation, energy procurement, metabolism, maintaining the integrity of the soma, social regulation, that comes without mind applied to it, and ensuring of species continuation. That's part of the general idea of homeostasis, although of course nobody created homeostasis as such. why you cannot talk about a feeling that is indifferent. A feeling that is indifferent is absurd, okay? And something which is important to return to the idea of medicine, feelings are natural reports on the momentary state of life within an organism. Now this may sound like a very simple statement. It's not. It's very complex. And what I want to remind everybody in this audience is that when you don't need to go to the doctor to find out that you may be sick, you discover that thanks to feelings. Feelings will tell you if you are okay or if you actually need to pay attention to your health and go and see a doctor, okay? Or a magician, for whatever. Anyway, next. In complex organisms, and now we come into a little bit of the story that has to do with the brain itself, because I don't want you to live with the idea that you get all of these feelings and you get the emotive processes without a hook on the brain. Brains do come in handy for certain things. In complex organisms, the command units for the execution of the action programs are located in specific subcortical brain regions. And those regions are itemized there: the periaqueductal gray, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens and the ventral pallidum, and the hypothalamus. Not the hippocampus, the hypothalamus. And in the next image, you have an image that Hanna created. This is an image of the human brain taken with the 7 Tesla brain scan. And you'll see all these structures that I don't want to look up because I will fall for sure. You will see that I'm mentioning there the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the periaqueductal gray. Think about the periaqueductal gray as a very important one, because that's actually a structure that has cellular columns out of which you can generate programs of pleasant response or of anger and violence. In fact, a lot of the violence that is produced as an ultimate consequence of anger is generated out of cells there. Why is this so important? Is that we have the false impression very often from what we get in traditional descriptions that all of this stuff is coming out of the cerebral cortex. Well, it isn't. It's coming out fundamentally of much older structures that are actually in the upper and back part of the brainstem. And that's where these command units are. Now, it doesn't mean that the cerebral cortex does not play in this, but the trigger points are not there. Now, some commands for action programs actually originate in the cerebral cortex, and you have another image that Hanna created there. You have the cerebral cortex all in colors and with regions. It doesn't come this way naturally. The colors were added, so don't worry. And it doesn't come with numbers either, so it's a little bit more complicated than what appears. But there are structures there that also serve as command units. Now, the command can result from internal conditions of the organism or from external conditions. So again, this internal or external push. But what is very important is to know that the brain is constantly surveying the systems that are connected with the outside world, that are connected with the inside world, and with a part of the inside world that is the world of our imagination. So think of the complexity of the human cerebral cortex as a sort of big surveillance machine. It's actually a big data, big surveillance machine. It's a sort of massive espionage set of actions that is constantly finding out about what is going on in all of these different territories and trying to respond accordingly. So, the consequences of deploying an action program that is provoked are represented within the brain sectors that are concerned with surveying the state of the body. So out of that surveillance, when you're surveying your internal conditions, you get to see how you responded internally to something in your mind or to something you've seen or to both. And feelings depend on that representation. And here I'm going to tell you something very important. This has to do with a lot of recent research. is that the body state representations depend on signals that are conveyed to the central nervous system, CNS, and the way the signals get there is far more complicated than people thought. So some of the systems are, some of the signals appear in the central nervous system as a result of chemical molecules that are being picked up directly by the nervous system. People have this impression that there's the peripheral nervous system that brings signals into the brain. It's not only. Chemically, the molecules that are floating around in our blood can, through capillaries, get directly into the brain at some peculiar parts of the brain, such as the area postrema or the circumventricular organs. And the most recent actually has to do with the spinal ganglia. Imagine, if you think about your body, you have, of course, vertebra, and you have spinal ganglia at every level of the vertebra. The spinal ganglia have one part that is devoid of blood-brain barrier. And guess what happens? The blood can directly affect the neurons that are packed in that region. And you know what they can do? That can actually alter the transmission of what would be a signal of pain. So just think of the beauty of this. It's not that you have signals that come directly, like in a phone line, to the central nervous system. You have signals that can be affected by the body itself and what is going on in that body in terms of chemical reaction, in terms of disease, in terms of the wine you had at dinner and so forth, and can alter the transmission. So you have multiple ways in getting the signal, and there's nothing like a simple construction of what is going on in the periphery of the body or what is going on outside in terms of the central nervous system. And there's another component to this, which is the enteric nervous system, which is very important. And to make the final point on this is that there are certain regions of the central nervous system where all of this information is put together. And again, it doesn't happen only in the cerebral cortex. It happens at the level of the brainstem, the hypothalamus, the telencephalic subcortex, such as the nucleus accumbens or the amygdala, and then, for sure, in cerebral cortex, in structures such as the insula. So when you look at that, that's just gives you an idea of the different stages through which signals can go. It's not, again, a telephone signal, a telephone cable that goes from A to B. This has many layers and levels, and this can be affected at many, many points. And in this next slide, there's something that is perhaps even more important, is that within this region of the upper brainstem, which we call attention because it has regions that can trigger emotive reactions, there's also a huge possibility of mixing signals that come from the outside with signals from the inside. And there's a very peculiar way for signals to literally go around in a cooperative reactivity. And this is very important because one of the things that I want all of you to leave with today is the fact that we do not believe for a second that what we call minds, which every one of us has, is a product only of neurons and brains alone. It's a product of neurons and neural systems operating in very close cooperation with other parts of the organism. So it's still all about life, it's all about homeostasis, but it's not the brain alone. We do not have just neurons making minds. In fact, even within the nervous system by itself, what is quite clear now, the more we know about nervous system, is that even glial cells that are around the neurons are in intense crosstalk with those neurons and are, in a way, on the body side of things and are affecting the entire process. This is very important. One other image for you to have one more picture of the brain. This insular cortex that I mentioned, if you look at it from the outside, as you have there, you would, with luck, see that little pink part because it's a cortex that is buried under the rest of the cerebral cortex. But then you can now go through it, and that's something that Hanna created to show this structure appearing, and that pink part is this huge territory of the insula, but it's not visible to the naked eye. You need to go in there to search for it. And the other blue part is the cingulate cortex, which is also very involved in emotive and feeling responses. And in the next, you actually see the real structure in a real brain. And this is a structure that is extremely complex with very intricate circuitry. You might say, so since you talked about brain at the level of the cortex and at the level of the brain stem, what's the big difference? Why do we have these two systems? What does the insular cortex do relative to the brain stem? And that's what comes next. The upper brain stem nuclei actually provide the first full organism integration of body states available to the nervous system, whereas the insular cortices provide a more explicit map of feeling states than the brainstem can provide. There's more territory to have the clarification of the signals, and it's a map that is suitable for interconnecting to other cortical maps related to memory, to reasoning, to language, and to what I like to call sociocultural homeostasis. So let's bring this to a close now with a number of ideas. First, since we called attention to feelings, what are the consequences of having feelings? Can we do without them? The good news and the bad news is that we can't. And feelings, in the very least, let me go to the next one, force attention on the body conditions that cause them. So to have a feeling, whether it is a positive feeling or a feeling of pain and suffering, forces you to pay attention. That's the fundamental cognitive consequence of feelings, and that's why they're not dispensable. They're keeping you in track. And of course, by doing so, feelings open the way to learning of adverse as well as advantageous situations, and that learning permits the anticipation of future scenarios and the planning of suitable behaviors. So there's nothing trivial about this, on the contrary. So in the next, I would say that feelings are sentinels, monitors, and motivators. They confer benefits on the individual and evolutionary advantages on the species. That's perfectly clear. And last, feelings open the way for a higher level of homeostatic regulation driven by conscious deliberation. So we have this incredible situation. We have a complex organism that is, in a way, on its own autopilot and can regulate a lot of what is going on. But that regulation by itself, given our complexity, would fall apart if we had not added over evolution this other part of regulation that has to do with what we accomplish once we are aware of feelings. And it so happens that a good part of that regulation, the instruments and the practices, are actually what we have called over time cultures in all of their aspects, whether it is science or technology or the means of governance, or, quite importantly, a variety of systems of belief and systems of moral behavior, or for that matter, with the arts, which are not, contrary to what some people might think, useless things added on to the mix. They have played a very important role in human development, and they continue to play that very important role. We can discuss that on another occasion. There's no time for that. So, what I would like to say now to close, before we go into break and discussion, is what are the critical faculties of cultural minds, and what are fundamental conditions that we need to have if we're going to have these cultures that we talked about. So, I think I have 4 there on the list. The first is that minds require nervous systems. This might be a little bit brutal, but it is brutal on purpose. This is what I believe in, and it's there. I don't mind at all if one fine day somebody's going to prove that I'm wrong, so be it. But I think that what we call minds cannot emerge, did not emerge, without having nervous systems. And the next is that minds depend on map making and images. This is very interesting and exciting. You know, I talked about bacteria recognizing other bacteria. How do they do that? It's quite amazing. So you have this little creature, little, with a membrane, no nucleus, but a very complex cytoplasm. And you have on the surface of the membrane, they're literally probes. But those probes are not perceiving the same way that you are perceiving me here, with a certain resemblance, with a certain pattern, a certain configuration visually, and a certain configuration auditorily, because what I'm producing in terms of organized sound has a certain configuration and is being perceived by you as an auditory image. The same way that yesterday we were listening to a concert where we were perceiving certain auditory images that concern music. Okay, what the bacteria are doing is detecting the presence of a certain molecular probe. So it's literally something that is sticking out, and that gives an identifier, which is actually a protein that identifies. It's like having a license plate for that particular bacterium. This is not a configuration, it's not an image. What we call minds, and that we all share in this room, is this incredibly beautiful, complex set of flowing images, some visual, some auditory, some that have to do with tact, some that have to do with smell and taste, and so forth. And very importantly, some have to do with the way we imagetically represent the state of our body, the state of contraction of blood vessels, the contraction of smooth muscle, the state in which we represent the beating of our hearts, or the rhythm at which we breathe, the state with which the muscles in the gut are represented. So we're making images with all of that. And that's why you need to have something, we need to ascend in complexity and generate those complex representations that I call images, and that are fundamental if we're going to have minds. And when you do that, then you can have minds about the outside world, you can have minds about what you remember, and you can, which of course you remember images, you can have minds of the future, because you can project it into the future, and you have mind in relation to feelings, in relation to the state of the organism. Okay. Point number 3 was that conscious minds depend on feelings. I've just talked about it. And then the last point, and I think it is the last, feelings, memory, and language are behind the exceptional status of humans. This is very important, because some of you could say, look at this idiot. He comes here and he tells us that we humans are hooked on bacteria and on those creatures that you can sort of step on and destroy. And I don't think I'm being an idiot. What I think I am doing is telling you that our construction of humanity depends on those other structures that come back to nearly 4 billion years ago. And there's, in fact, what I'm doing is connecting the dots so that you can connect life and homeostasis to what we are today. But I'm not diminishing humans at all. On the contrary, I'm, again, going back to the beginning of the talk, I'm saying that humans have complex brains, that humans have very complex feelings, and have a very complex intellectual machinery, which has given it one of its exceptional abilities, which is the ability to create cultures. You know, in spite of all the beauties that we can find in social insects, and that we can find in bacteria, and that we can find in a lot of mammals that are non-human, the fact is that there's nothing that faintly resembles what we have created that allow us, for example, to have this conversation tonight. Okay, so this is exceptional, and we have to affirm that exceptional status. And then there's something else that is very important, And that has to do with what happens with our memory. So, without a doubt, I expect chimpanzees or dog lovers who have dogs and cats at home to expect that there is pain and suffering or pleasure in all of those creatures. Of course there is, from the looks of it. However, do we expect that the suffering that a human being will have will be exactly like the suffering that one of those other species will have? You could say, well, given the homology of the structures, given that they all share things that we have also in our brains, chances are there's some core that is actually very comparable. However, what they are unlikely to have is two things. First, the wealth of memory that we have that allows us to have this vast past memory that connects with our memories all the way to childhood. And something that is even less likely that they have, which is memory projected into the future, those memories of the future that I talked about. So if somebody now comes to you and says, sorry, you have cancer, and you have 6 months to live, that is going to be a different process, and the way a human will process that is necessarily different because there's access to this vast projection into the future and the constant combination intellectually between the projected future and the past, which gives the depth of suffering, or for that matter, the depth of the transcendence that you can feel, a completely different dimension. So once again, thanks to minds, thanks to begin with to nervous systems, and thanks to this huge complexity of the cultural edifice that we have created, we are truly exceptional, and we should not be ashamed to recognize in other species a lot of things that are in fact the basis for what we have become. Okay? Thank you very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us also thank Professor Hanna Damasio, the co-author of the talk we've just heard. Szanowni Państwo, krótkie ogłoszenie już teraz po polsku. Robimy 20 kilka minut przerwy, wracamy z dyskusją o błędzie Kartezjusza o godzinie 20:30. Ta dyskusja też będzie transmitowana online.